Hi everyone, it's Vu again. In my last video, I was talking about how you can get a job as a programmer without any experience or even a degree. In this video, we're going to get real personal. I'm going to be talking about my own personal experience about how I was able to get a job without a degree or any background experience in programming. As I mentioned in the past, I dropped out of college when I was 18 years old and I got my first job when I was around 18 as well. People joke about this all the time, but I'm Asian. I got really good grades through grades K to 12. I was always generally top of my class. I skipped some classes here and there and also graduated with a 4.0 GPA. Although I was a top student, I actually didn't learn how to program at a young age. Actually, that was something I felt really behind when compared to some of my friends. I had other friends out there, they didn't get like the best grades in the world, but they programmed since they were like 5 or 6 or 7 years old. They learned from their parents, they learned through extra classes and courses, and I felt really super behind there. It wasn't until I was 16 years old or so that I took my first programming course. That course was really basic. It was taught in Java. It basically just showed you the very rudimentary parts of programming. But after that first course, I kind of had this intuition that I felt like maybe I want to explore this a little bit more. Pretty okay at it, and I really like tinkering with stuff. So it was definitely something I was considering in the future. When I was around 17 and a half years old, I found out that I got admitted to the University of Washington. So I grew up in Washington State. The University of Washington is a public university, and it's basically the public university that's serving kind of my area. I always thought I wanted to become a doctor, not because my parents wanted me to do it or anything like that, but I thought it was like a very noble pursuit. The money was good, and I really wanted to help people. However, with my coursework in computer science, I wanted to figure out how I could kind of blend those two sorts of things. Like, how can I continue with my interest in the medical field, and then how I can continue exploring my new interest in like science and engineering. What I then decided to do was I thought, okay, there's something that exists called biomedical engineer, right? So you get to engineer medical technologies and innovate on that field. I thought that would be a perfect sort of marriage between the two things I love. So when I got accepted to University of Washington, I declared my major as a biomedical engineer. As time went on, I slowly grew my programming skills a bit over time. It was like generally those summers where I was hanging out with other people that were kind of like-minded. I was telling you about friends that were better programmers than I was. So there was this nonprofit organization that I was an early member of called Student R&D. It's now called Code Day. But what that basically was is it was like a kind of an excuse for us to hang out at one of our friend's house that had air conditioning. His name is Edward Zhang. Ed, if you're watching this, hello. But that's where I continue to develop my skills in programming and then my interests there. I remember in 2008, iOS, Apple, and like mobile devices in general were just in the really infant stages of its development now. Not everybody had a smartphone. I remember at Student R&D, I was able to use their Mac Mini to develop iPhone applications. And during that time, in 2008, during the summer, one of the biggest things was the World Cup. And if you don't remember, that was held in South Africa. And one of the memes of that World Cup was something called the Vuvuzela. I'm not sure if you remember that, but it was like this large tube that you blew into and then like it made a lot of noise, and they had to like ban it or something like that, or just like reduce the noise, because when you're watching these soccer games, it was just like bzzz, this buzzing sort of noise. It was super annoying. So anyways, I thought, okay, how about I make a Vuvuzela app? It's within my name, it's Vuvuzela, right? It's like a match made in heaven. So one of my first iOS apps that I made was this really stupid app. If you remember in 2008, it was just like a bunch of like fart apps and whatnot on iOS. So I made this button, this Vuvuzela, that when you hit it, it just played a sound that was like super duper annoying. And that was like my first experience actually making an iOS app. I know that it wasn't much, but in my last video, I was talking about how it's super important to trying to find ways you can learn that also matches up with like your inner passions. And my inner passions was always just to make something of a huge joke, you know. So I thought, vuvuzelas, that sounds really stupid. This is a stupid app. Let's do it. Let's go for it. So now switching back to university, it was like my first year in university. I was still trying to go through this biomedical engineering route. So I had to take linear algebra, differential equations, advanced calculus. I already had 2 years of credit basically from Bellevue College. I was already well ahead, and these courses at Bellevue College were legitimate college courses that were equivalent to the University of Washington. So I came in basically 2 years faster than anybody else. However, the problem with university when I transitioned there was I lived on campus, and I didn't study as hard as I should have. I actually didn't attend a lot of my courses, a lot of my math courses, because, I was busy playing StarCraft 2.
You must construct additional pylons.
Just came out in like 2009, I think, the beta, and I was obsessed with it. I was playing it like every single day. My roommate was Edward at that time. His alias was Edward StarCraft, and we'd cast games in the very early days of StarCraft. He ended up, making a little bit of a name for himself there, but eventually over time, I realized this was really eating up into my ability to study. I wasn't like sleeping, sometimes even before midterms and finals, I'd be like playing StarCraft. So needless to say, my grades weren't that great. They weren't bad, but they weren't excellent. I was no longer the 4.0 student, and my GPA dropped to something around like 3.0. Now, one of the things to know about the University of Washington, it's one of the top CS programs in the world, right? Particularly for a public university. It has a very, very competitive computer science program. I think at that time, I talked to my counselors and whatnot because I was curious about wanting to potentially switch into computer science. This is when, I started exploring programming a little bit more, and I thought, like, yeah, maybe I actually want to do computer science. So I spoke to the guidance counselor, and they told me that, hey, it's going to be really hard. Every single year, I think during that time, they had something like 400 or maybe it was like 800 students apply to the UW CS program, and they were only able to accept maybe 40% of people. So it was an acceptance rate of like 5%. It was extremely, extremely low and competitive. I remember one specific event that really helped solidify my decision to go into computer science. I had a friend and we were taking like an astrology class together because it was like a general elective for science, and he was in the computer science program and he was like a senior there, and I just had a free period after that class, so we were just kind of hanging out, and he was telling me about how afterwards he was going to go to this computer science job fair that they had hosted on campus. And he asked me if I wanted to come along, and I was like, okay, sure, I'll go check it out. And the thing was, in order to get into that job fair itself, you had to be part of the computer science program. They'd actually check for that. But when we got to the door, we just kind of like walked in as if, I knew what I was doing, and I guess I looked the part, like Asian nerdy kid, and my friend was a legitimate CS student, so I think they just like checked his credentials, his background, whatever it was, and then they just let me in with them. They didn't bother to check mine, right? So when we actually got into this job fair, there was like every single big tech company there at the time. So I remember Microsoft was there, Facebook was there, Google was there, as well as several other soon-to-be large companies like Zillow, LinkedIn. There was other companies as well, like, Expedia, hotels.com, those kind of things, as well as, startups and other kind of like unknown sorts of things. What I realized going there was I had this remedial knowledge about mobile engineering, and I was just really, I had nothing to lose, so I was just really casual. I was talking to the people there hiring, and they all really, really wanted me to work for them. I was like, yeah, I do some mobile engineering. They're like, wow, we really need a mobile intern. Like, can you come interview? Do you have a resume that you can give us? And I was like, oh no, I don't. I'm actually not prepared, but maybe I can take your email. And they're like, yeah, take my email and stuff like that. That's when I sort of knew, like, wow, this is going to be huge. Everybody seems to legitimately really, really want me to work there. What am I doing in biomedical engineering? It seems like computer science, it seems like programming is the way to go. It seems like it's the future, right? After that day, I had this new resolve. I was like, okay, I'm gonna switch majors. I'm gonna apply to that computer science program at UW, and this is gonna be it. I'm gonna do that. I went to apply, and it was really nerve-wracking, and I wish I could tell you that they accepted me, but they didn't. It was really hard for me because up until that point, I was always the top student. I always got into like my first pick. The University of Washington was my first choice for a university. My SAT scores were pretty okay, like my ACT scores are pretty good. But when I went to apply to computer science, I got rejected because my grades weren't good enough. My grades for math had to be something like in the 3.8. 3.9 plus GPA. It had to be the top 5% of those in that field, and mine just frankly wasn't. I wasn't a good enough student in that regard. So anyways, I was super disappointed. I was super devastated. I remember that I felt so bad and I felt so sorry for myself because I was already 2 years into university at this point, and the next time I could apply again for the CS program at UW was in another 6 months, so that's like half a year. That's half a year that I'd have to be taking kind of like BS electives in university that wasn't going to advance my knowledge of programming anymore. I felt like it was a waste of time and my energy. Also, another thing to consider was that I had financial aid, I had scholarships, so I was basically getting paid to go to university, which I was like super fortunate about. I didn't have to take any student loans or anything like that, but they paid for all my expenses, and I still remember every single quarter after like everything, after I paid for like textbooks and like housing and food, I probably still had like 1 or 2K left as like pocket change that I can essentially use for anything, and that was super nice. Like 1 to 2K was a lot of money for me back then because my family didn't come from, we weren't a wealthy family by any means, so that sort of financial freedom was really super important for me. I felt like I can actually live my life, right? So I was at a crossroads here, like what would I do? What do I do now? And I didn't really have a super good answer to that. Finally, I thought though, hey, I'm not gonna let this get to me. I gotta get back on my horse. I got to keep on trying, because I remembered what it was like at the job fair. Like, hey, maybe I can get an internship. Maybe I can apply to these places. And because of some of my background in making these iOS apps, that some of these companies might give me a shot, right? So what I did was I tried to produce a resume and I applied. I applied to every single company that was looking for interns. This wasn't over the summer, and this was over the fall, so it was actually even more competitive because a lot of these companies, most of their internship programs happened over the summer, right? So I was competing for even fewer slots. I remember applying for something like 40 or maybe even over 50 companies out there. You name it, like Facebook, LinkedIn, Google, Adobe, whatever it is, like all the cool large tech companies, you name it, I applied. And that's when things started to go south. I didn't hear back from a lot of these companies. And the ones that were curious enough to send me a rejection, a lot of the rejection was that, hey, you need to show more course work in computer science. We're like, please apply next year. We're not going to accept you, unfortunately, at this time. And that felt pretty bad. Like every single one of the big companies basically told me that. Fortunately, I did manage to get something like 15 in-person interviews here. But to be honest, there were only 2 that I vividly remember from this time. Those 2 were from Zillow and from F5 Networks. The reason why I remember F5 Networks so vividly was because it was one of the first tech companies that I interviewed for. And also, it was a company that I legitimately really wanted to work for. Before, in the past, I had done mostly mobile engineering, mostly UI and front-end work, but with F5 Networks, I thought, hey, this is a very legit tech company, and interning there could really help me learn all of these things, all these fundamentals that I wasn't able to learn at school. So I remember a week before that interview, I got this book, and it was like 100 interview questions for the tech process or something, 100 technical interviews, or like how to ace the technical interview, something like that. And I remember cramming on that as much as I could in the past week, putting my course load at school on the side and just like cramming. When I got to F5 on the day of the interview, I remember being told that there were 5 other candidates that they were interviewing kind of simultaneously, and they only had a spot for one intern at the time. And I thought, okay, 1 out of 5, that's a pretty decent shot. I'm going to come in, I'm going to do the best job that I can. That entire day, I still remember quite vividly, for better or for worse. The first interview I was in was pretty rough, I'm not gonna lie. The question that they asked was first like this puzzle sort of question. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but there's like this like kids puzzle where it's like you have 2 sides on a river in the middle, right? On one side is you, and then like a wolf, a chicken, and a bag of rice or something like that, right? So the idea is that the chicken and the rice can't be together, and the wolf and the chicken can't be together, right? And then you have like this raft that can only take 2 passengers at a time plus you, something like that, and then you had to ferry them all across the other side without having the chicken eat the rice and the wolf eat the chicken, blah, 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 blah. So the first part of that was just to try to come up to an answer in as few as steps as possible. And then the next part of that was to try to architect a program that can help optimize it for you. I remember with that interview problem, I struggled even getting the first part. I struggled even solving that problem without any programming whatsoever. So much so that we had to cut it short because it was an hour-long interview and I had already exceeded the 30-minute allotted time. The second question that was asked during that interview was something like this. I think it was like, you have a staircase with n number of steps. You can traverse that staircase by taking either 1 step or skipping a step and taking 2 steps, right? How many ways is there to traverse the staircase where n is like an arbitrary number, right? Figure it out. Again, I struggled there. I couldn't even come up with the math to solve it, so then we kind of had to skip that problem. Then I was told that the answer had to do with, I can't remember exactly, I think Fibonacci's number or like the golden ratio. I guess they're one and the same thing. Yeah, but what I had to do was then implement the Fibonacci sequence recursively and then be able to do that without recursion. I was able to do it with recursion, but then I kind of struggled to do it without recursion. Looking backwards, oh my God, like I want to kick myself in the face. That just goes to show how inexperienced I was. The second part of the interview I was in, the second hour slot, was more theoretical. The question that this person asked was just, are you familiar with the 7 network layers? And draw on a diagram what they are and what they do, and explain it in as detailed way as possible. Luckily, like a week before, because I knew I was interviewing F5 networks and they do networking, I picked up this book all about the 7 layers of networking, and I just tried to memorize it as best as I could. So during the interview, I just regurgitated as much information as I could. To this day, I can hardly name like maybe 3 layers of networking. It goes to show like how little I retained there. But I think the second interview, I did a lot better, came out there with really no issues. The third and final portion of the interview, I was asked to basically code on a whiteboard. I was asked to implement basically a stack class, and I just have to write it out and we'd talk it through. I asked the interviewer, hey, what kind of programming language should I write it in? And he said, like, just do whatever you're familiar with. And I told him, okay, the only language I'm like super familiar with is Objective-C. Can I do it in Objective-C? I think he was kind of surprised because you have to remember that at this point, if you remember, iOS was not like a big deal yet. Like Objective-C was very quite niche. So I wasn't sure that he was familiar with Objective-C at all. So I think he was taken a little bit aback. I went in there and I tried to code as best as I could. And I'm not sure if you remember what Objective-C was like in 2008. The whole thing was like a mess. It was a very quite archaic language. And it was more closely related to C than it even was to C++, to be honest. It had like brackets all over the place. You had to manually allocate your memory pool. You had to manually retain your memory and then release it. So on that board there, maybe only 30% of that code was anything stack related, and then the other 70% was me trying to figure out memory management. Again, I think I did okay. I think I took up a lot of the time just dealing and explaining the nuances of Objective-C. And I think the interviewer probably had some follow-up questions there, but we weren't able to get through it just because of like how bad Objective-C was at that time. So I came out of that interview feeling pretty all right. There were 3 segments to it. I knew I had flubbed the first one pretty hard, but I thought maybe number 2 and number 3 would sort of, at least allow them to consider me for the internship position. It took about a week or so, and they finally got back to me, and I was rejected. That was hard. They told me that, essentially they liked my spirit. I did okay, but really during the interview, I just didn't demonstrate enough computer science fundamentals for them to take me, so they'd be moving on with somebody else. That felt bad. I walled on that for a little bit, but luckily I had another interview coming up with Zillow, and what I did was I got those books again. I started studying again, and I was a lot more optimistic about Zillow because the position I was applying for was specifically titled Mobile Engineering Intern, and again, like I have experience. I had a little bit of experience in mobile development with Objective-C. I built some really crappy apps before, so I felt like I had a better chance at acing this interview. What happened next was probably one of the most memorable experiences of my life, and one that would shape me dramatically as a programmer. I went into Zillow, and I remember the first interview I had straight off the bat was with a director, I believe, director of mobile engineering, that would interview me. And I remember the problem that he gave me was an algorithm question. It was like this CS, very low level programming question. And I was completely taken aback by it. I was very surprised. I came in there thinking that they would ask me mobile engineering questions, like questions around UIKit and iOS and how to implement this and actually code. But what they wanted me to do was, essentially solve some math problem on the board using low-level programming. It became immediately clear that I wasn't going to succeed at this interview question. And I remember this interviewer asking me like, okay, do you study CS right now? And I told him, like, honestly, no, I'm actually not enrolled in a computer science program. And he was like, oh, okay, I see. Have you learned anything about bitwise manipulation? And I told him, no, I never heard of bitwise manipulation before. And he said, oh, okay, give me one moment. And he walked out of the room. And when he came in, he just told me, okay, I'm sorry, but I think there was a mistake here. We're not going to be moving forward with this interview, and then we want to be conscious of your time and our programmers' time. We're just going to be ending this interview basically right here. What I would recommend you do is continue to take CS courses and learn the CS fundamentals. That was definitely one of the lowest moments in my CS career. I was so frustrated because I had put in so much work and so much effort learning how to be an iOS engineer and prepare myself for iOS questions. Because literally this job title said, iOS engineer intern. And what happened was they asked me none of that. None of my knowledge came in. And you know what? To this day, I hardly ever use bitwise manipulation, only for things like flags and stuff like that. And even then, I copy and paste it, It was such a useless interview question that to this day, I hate it. I detest asking anybody algorithm questions or those CS trivia questions, because I just never found that it closely related to a programmer's ability to actually do their job, right? it might have a certain time and place. I'm not saying that all algorithm questions are bad, but if you're only going to be asking algorithm questions when it comes to interviewing, you're not going to have this holistic understanding about what this programmer can actually do. And for me, that was really discouraging, and it was terrible. It was a terrible experience. So at this point, I had already flunked something like 15 in-person interviews. I thought I was never going to get a job. I had lost like a lot of my hope. I remember receiving an email from another place that I had applied to, and this place was called General UI. It's now called GenUI. It's still around. And they asked if I would come in for an interview something like later that week. That day is a day that I will remember for a very long time. I still remember it vividly. The office was in this weird space-themed building in Fremont, Seattle. It was like quite eccentric. I didn't know what I was expecting. And I remember walking into that office. It was 200 square feet. It was like a really small office building, and there was only 2 people in there. The general manager, Jason Thane, and then basically like an office administrator. We sat down and we began the interview. It was really casual. He just asked me about my personal life, about my background, kind of my hobbies. I told him about Student R&D, the nonprofit I had mentioned before, and about how I was helping and volunteering my time, and also learning how to program there. I told him also about kind of like the small apps I made. So I told him about the Vuvuzela app, and I also told him about another app I was working called the Inception button. During that time, Inception had just came out, and I'm not sure if you remember like kind of like those Hans Zimmer like noises there. All the app does is, you hit a button and it makes like this Hans Zimmer noise, like this really dramatic effect. But I remember we were like having a cool conversation about it, and he was like, wow, that's kind of cool. Like I'd pay $1 for it. Like it's going to sell like hotcakes. He was like very encouraging, right? And then I think we were just talking for maybe like 40 minutes or so. And after those 40 minutes are up, he just said, okay, Vu, at this point, I'm ready to extend you an offer for an internship. And we're going to pay you $15 an hour. How does that sound? I was super surprised. I even remember asking like, oh wait, like you're not going to ask me to program? Like I brought my computer here. We can like go through some technical questions. And he was like, no, I get good vibes from you. You seem like a smart dude. It's all cool. Yeah. When can you start? I owe Jason so much. I owe him my entire career probably, because if I didn't get that job, I probably might have given up. I probably would have quit. And there are so few people out in the world out there that were willing to give me a shot. And only from a 40-minute conversation with me, not even about programming, he saw kind of beyond where I was and thought, okay, this guy seems to have passion, he seems to have drive, and seems to have energy. That changed the course of my life, really. He offered me $15 an hour, which I thought, holy crap, like this is so much money. That was like more money than I have ever made or seen in my life. I remember like after the first week of working there, I got paid, well, maybe it was like the first 2 weeks or something like that. I got my paycheck and it was like $300, right? I was like, holy moly, I can buy like a PlayStation 2 with that amount of money, like I was like, oh my gosh, I'm never gonna have to like worry about money ever again. It was crazy. From that point on, I was committed. I wanted to work as hard as possible, and I wanted to show Jason that he made the right decision hiring me. I was still in university. I was still trying to take a full coursework. I was in the middle of my quarter. I remember my last class would get out at like 2 p.m. or 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and I'd jump on a bus. I'd go immediately to General UI, and I'd just code. I'd just work for 8 hours a day until like 11 and sometimes even 1 a.m. In that office. I'd be the one like locking it up, actually. And then I'd go home, I'd sleep for a little bit. I wake up at like 4 a.m. in the morning, and then I'd try to study. And then I'd go to class then, and then do the same thing over again. That was really tough. I managed to skirt by midterms and finals, but I knew that was not something that was super sustainable. So when it came down to it, with my finals, it was still 1 quarter away before I could apply to the computer science program at UW again. And this was like, I had worked there at GenUI now for like 2 months or so. And I told Jason kind of my problem here. I told him that, I was considering maybe just taking the next quarter off and maybe I could work for GenUI full time. Again, this is another moment that I will never forget. He was completely supportive of that. Actually, what he told me is that, hey, come work for me next quarter, and what I'm going to do for you right now is I'm going to double your salary. Basically, he took my salary from $15 to $28 an hour. He told me, hey, with the work that you've been doing, you deserve it. You've actually been working a lot harder than an intern. You're basically just like a full-time programmer. It's actually my fault, he said. He said, it's my fault that we've been underpaying you, and I'm sorry about that. We're gonna make your salary more competitive now. Jason didn't have to do that. He didn't have to like sit down with me and teach me how to program. I remember when we were talking about iOS and development and stuff like that, he gave me this rubric about how I can progress and like things I needed to learn. He was telling me how like, oh, like if you're really advanced, then what you should be able to do is build your Xcode project from the terminal. And then I was like trying to figure it out. He didn't have to do any of this, but he went out of his way to really make sure that I learned, and he went out of his way to bump up my salary just because he thought it was fair. Jason, thank you so much. A lot of these things have still stuck with me. Oh my God, I didn't think I'd get emotional here, but these things compared to Zillow, at Zillow, they didn't give me a shot. They asked me like a stupid question that didn't take into account my personal, my person at all. From that point on, I knew like, hey, I don't want to ask people algorithm questions. I always want to give people a shot. I always want to believe in people, and I always want to invest in people. So always as an engineering manager, like, hey, maybe you're watching this and, like maybe I was your manager at one point, but I will always bat for people, and I will always take time with people, and I always trust people. And it was because of my experience with Jason. Anyways, this story is getting a little bit longer now, and there's still a lot of additional details there. Basically, what ended up happening was I took a full-time job at GenUI, and then I stayed there for another 3 months, and it became that time again for me to reapply to the computer science program at the University of Washington. And I had learned so much already working at this full-time job that I thought, what more can university teach me? It's always going to be there for me, but at this point, I'm already a productive engineer. Why go back? To be honest, I was a bitter. I remember printing out my rejection letter from the University of Washington, and I framed it, and I looked at it, and I thought, like, one of these days, I'm going to be such a great programmer and rise through the ranks and whatnot, that they'd ask me to come back and give like a commencement speech at UW, and I just tell them like, go screw themselves, like that's how bitter and angry I am. But I fueled all that bitterness into just like learning how to code as best as possible. So that's how I got my first job as a programmer, because somebody trusted me and I got incredibly lucky. This is going to be a common theme throughout my life. I'd call this part one. I'm going to tell you in the future videos too about how I went from this job to another job, to starting my own company and getting accepted into Y Combinator as one of the youngest founders ever there, to doing 3 startups, to joining Postmates, and then joining Snapchat. It's a very long story. This video was already long enough, but that was sort of my first chapter here. So in summary, what I learned through this process here is that it was really hard. It really tested my ability not to give up. And one of the things that I do want to make clear is I didn't drop out of college because I was smart. I dropped out of college because I was actually stupid. I was too stupid. I didn't work hard enough at the right things to get good grades. And it was through a lot of luck and somebody believing in me that I even got, my first shot. So I'm really grateful out there, and just know that if you guys are in a similar position as I am, it just kind of takes that one chance to kind of be lucky, but it takes a lot of hard work in order to get there. So yeah, that's part one about how I got a job as a programmer without a degree. I hope you found some inspiration in that, and if you like the story, please hit the like button If you want to hear about part 2 coming up here, then please subscribe to it as well. And as always, thank you very much, and thank you for listening.